By the turn of the 20th century, the Chinese people were proud of their long and illustrious history, but dismayed and humiliated by their country's domination by Japanese and Western powers over the latter half of the 19th century. China had fought to resist the foreigners in the Opium Wars, numerous popular rebellions, and the Sino-Japanese War, but it lacked a modernized military and suffered tremendous casualties. At the end of the 19th century, the Western powers and Japan had forced China's ruling Qing dynasty to accept wide foreign control over the country's economic affairs. Although the ordinary people were preoccupied with day-to-day survival, the more influential members of society were increasingly looking for a way to challenge the foreign powers. By the late 1890s, a Chinese secret group called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists had begun carrying out regular attacks on foreigners and Chinese Christians. Because the main exercises done by its members involved martial arts using the hands, the society's members became known in the West as the Boxers. 800 training centers were set up, mainly in Shantung province, to teach the Boxers to box, as well as other martial arts. Any military training was minimal, and in most actions they relied on strength of numbers to overcome their enemies. They claimed to be immune to bullets, and helped to promote the myth by sometimes replacing Imperial Army cartridges with blanks before staging an encounter. Massed charges of Boxers armed only with swords and spears were routinely decimated by the accurate rifle and machine gun fire of Western troops. The Boxers had committed a number of atrocities for several years, especially in their power base in Shantung province. A large number of Christian missionaries had been slaughtered, although it was the Chinese Christian converts who suffered the most. All over northern and central China, the troubles were an excuse to attack Chinese Christians, with a reported 32,000 killed in the northwest alone. The aim of the movement was the expulsion of all foreigners from China, and the expulsion or killing of any Chinese Christian converts. By 1900, the Boxer movement had spread to the capital of Peking. At first, the Boxers had been opposed to the Qing dynasty and had ridiculed the imperial government for allowing the foreign exploitation of China. Fully aware of the danger that the Boxers posed to the imperial throne, the Empress Dowager began to secretly give them her support. Once the Boxers realized that the Empress Dowager was as anti-foreign as they were, there was no reason to attack the Qing dynasty. During the same year, the foreign legations in the Chinese capital Peking had been under pressure for several months. Reports of massacres of Chinese Christians and European missionaries by the Boxers had been received with alarm in the foreign community. The population of Peking started to grow as hundreds of foreign missionaries and Chinese Christians began flocking to the city for protection. The legations in Peking, fearing they would be isolated, quickly telegraphed for help. The number of foreign civilians was around 900, with 2,800 Chinese Christians taking refuge among them. The immediate response was the deployment of sailors and marines from foreign ships off of China's coast. The first relief mission was led by British Admiral Sir Edmund Seymour. He assembled a group of international armed forces that included Germans, French, Americans, Japanese, Italians, Austrians, and British troops that were stationed in Tientsin. Seymour had a total of 2,100 soldiers and sailors, and he crammed them onto 5 trains for their 80-mile journey to Peking on June 10th. The plan was to race across the 80 miles of railway between Tientsin and Peking and arrive hopefully in Peking by nightfall. The expedition ultimately would prove unsuccessful due to a strong defensive Chinese Imperial Army. Despite attempts by the foreign coalition to break through, their ultimate downfall came when the supplies began to run out and ammunition was low. They were therefore left with no other option but to retreat and return to Tientsin. On June 20th, 1900, the Boxers began a siege of Peking's foreign legation district, which contained the official quarters of all foreign diplomats. The following day, Qing Empress Dowager Cixi declared war on all foreign nations with diplomatic ties in China. When the siege began, the legation's total defense force was 543 men that included sailors, marines, and soldiers from the United States, the British Empire, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Germany, Japan, and Russia. In addition, a volunteer unit of 125 was formed from the civilian population of the legation quarter. Weaponry was limited to the rifles of the legation guards, plus some shotguns, a few machine guns, and some artillery. The artillery consisted of 2 guns, an Italian 1-pounder, and an international gun made up of leftover scrapped parts. The siege, which was to last a total of 55 days, was initially undertaken by Boxer forces alone, but they were soon joined by regular Imperial troops. Massed attacks by the poorly armed irregular Boxers and other volunteers proved unsuccessful against the professional forces defending the legations. Imperial troops were held back from these infantry attacks, and their officers were only too happy to let the Boxers do the fighting. Various tactics were used by the besiegers, including trying to burn the legation buildings down in the first days of the siege and mining underneath the walls. One of the biggest crises came at the end of June, when the Tartar wall above the legations was captured by the Chinese. Its occupation allowed the Chinese forces to fire down directly into the legations and would have ended the siege. However, a night attack by just a handful of US and British troops surprised the Chinese sentries and regained the wall on July the 3rd. A truce agreed on July 16th allowed both sides to recover and was especially timely for the defenders. It came just a few days after a mine had exploded underneath the French legation, almost destroying it. By the time of the truce, only 2/3 of the legation's guards were left, and several of the best commanders had been killed. By late July, morale rose at the legations when news began to arrive of the progress of a new relief expedition. Before the Allied Relief Army had a chance to rescue the legations, the defenders had already paid a heavy price. Of the soldiers, marines, and sailors defending the legations, 55 had been killed and 135 wounded. This was an astounding casualty rate of 46.5% and was testament to their bravery and determination to defend the legations. 13 civilians were also killed, along with 24 others wounded. The Allied Relief Army commanders had a number of issues that needed to be dealt with before the Peking legations could be rescued. 5 Chinese forts in Taku were becoming a major concern for the Allied war effort against the Boxers. If they chose, the Chinese troops in the forts could easily block the railway and river, leaving both Tientsin and Peking cut off from supplies. Allied troops began to land near the forts on June 16, 1900. This force of 904 men was made up mostly of Russian, British, German, and Japanese, with a few Italians and Austro-Hungarians. The forts were attacked in the early hours of June 17th, with the support of a small fleet of Allied ships and gunboats. When the Chinese saw the approaching ships, the fort's guns opened fire on them and the Allied troops began their assault. A direct hit on one of the fort's magazines caused a huge explosion which broke the morale of the defending Chinese troops. The forts were taken by assault by 5 a.m. on the same day. The city of Tientsin was also now under threat from around 10,000 Chinese troops, and would first have to be secured before a new relief mission for Peking was to be launched. Seymour's relief column returned back to the city despite the efforts of the Chinese Imperial Army to stop them, and reinforced the 2,400 Allied defenders already holed up in the international part of the city. Under heavy artillery bombardment from the Chinese Imperial Army, the Allied forces were under siege for a number of weeks before an offensive was launched on the 13th of July. By the next day, the Chinese quarter of Tientsin had fallen, with heavy casualties on both sides. With the Allied rear areas now secure following the fall of the Taku forts and Tientsin, a new relief force could now be organized. On August 4th, an 18,000-strong force moved out of Tientsin. The column was made up of 2,200 US troops with 6 guns, 2,900 British troops, 9,000 Japanese troops with 24 field guns, 2,900 Russians with 2 artillery batteries, and 1,200 French with 12 guns. Other contingents of Austro-Hungarians and Italians had to return back to Tientsin because of transport difficulties. In the relief column's path were an estimated 80,000 Chinese Imperial troops who were now officially at war with the Allied powers. They were now marching in the oppressive heat of a Chinese summer as the temperatures reached 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cloudless skies and the lack of any wind made conditions unbearable. The foreign troops first engaged and defeated the Chinese in the Battle of Besieged on August 5th. The Japanese proved instrumental in the fight, overcoming the Chinese and allowing the Foreign Alliance to march on. The following day they fought at the Battle of Yongsun, led by American soldiers who defeated the Chinese troops in sweltering heat. This victory allowed the Alliance to reach Tongzhou, only a few miles outside of Peking, on the 12th of August. The problem for the alliance, however, was that Peking had a formidable defense, comprising of a large city wall 21 miles long with 16 well-guarded gates. The inner city had its own wall surrounding it, which was 40 feet tall, and then an extra wall around the outer region of the city, with a large population living in between. On August 14th, the Foreign Relief Army made their first maneuvers, considerably weakened by the heat and lacking in numbers. They launched their attack, which ultimately turned into a competition between nations as to who would receive the credit for rescuing the besieged. 4 different national armies were to assault the city from different gates, the Russians taking the northern route, the Japanese further south, and the British and American troops at the southernmost gate. The Russians violated the plan and attacked the American gate after believing it to be lightly defended. However, after breaking through the gate, they became trapped in a nearby courtyard and suffered many casualties from murderous crossfire from Chinese forces. Once the Chinese defenders were alerted, they fired on the attackers and firefights broke out all over the city. Having found that their gate was already blasted open, the American troops moved their positions south and climbed a 30-foot wall, which enabled them to access a legation quarter in the shadows of the wall. Meanwhile, the Japanese were being held off by a strong defensive position, while the British passed through with ease. The easiest way to enter the besieged quarter was through a drainage canal, and so the British troops waded through the filth and mud and arrived, to be greeted happily by the beleaguered defenders. After a few hours of fighting, the Chinese troops began to lose heart, and the city had fallen by the evening of August 14th. Fighting continued for a while as the Forbidden City and its imperial palaces had to be captured from some last-ditch Chinese defenders. On the 15th, the Empress Dowager and her entourage escaped out of the city and began a trek of 700 miles to a temporary capital at Xi'an in Shanxi province. By the start of September, her representatives had arrived back in Peking to begin negotiations to end the war and allow the return of the imperial government to the capital. The Boxer Rebellion formally ended with the signing of the Boxer Protocol on September 7, 1901. By the terms of the agreement, forts protecting Peking were to be destroyed. Boxer and Chinese government officials involved in the uprising were to be punished. Foreign legations were permitted to station troops in Peking for their defense. China was prohibited from importing arms for 2 years, and it agreed to pay more than $330 million in reparations to the foreign nations involved. The Qing dynasty, established in 1644, was weakened by the Boxer Rebellion. Following an uprising in 1911, the dynasty came to an end and China became a republic in 1912.